All right, welcome back. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. This is part 2 of my conversation with Allison White. Allison White, principal at a Silicon Valley school, who, among many other things, has dealt with transgender kids, and that's the topic of our conversation. This is part 2. Go back and listen to the first part if you missed it, where we talk about a topic that you kind of think you know something about, or maybe you don't need to know something about, and you really do. The show notes were a little difficult. I don't know why it didn't translate real well, but there's a few conversations here that are referenced, and I'll just say them now so you can back up and go find these things. I'm just going to say them as basically Google searches or Bing searches if you watch certain ABC TV shows. But I'll tell you what they are. They're not going to make any sense this second, but if you hear it in the podcast and you want to come back and find it, we talked about a TED Talk, a John Oliver show, an NBC Nightly News show, and a Rolling Stone article. The TED Talk, look for Norman Spack, How I Help Transgender Teens Become Who They Want to Be. John Oliver, search for John Oliver Transgender. NBC Nightly News, Transgender Kids, search for that topic. And the Rolling Stone article about a girl, Coy Mathis' fight to change gender, which Allison quite highly recommends here. Anyway, this is part 2 of my conversation with Allison White, transgender kids in Silicon Valley. This is Something Ventured. Thanks for listening. Trans, queer, questioning, pan, you're like, okay, that's getting to be a lot. Like, is everyone just declaring that they're, something? Well, it's susceptible to being something you can make fun of.
I think because it's not visible. It's something that is a disconnect between someone's core identity, which is in their head, and that's not something that anybody can, there's not a blood test, there's not a set thing, and so that's where and so this is interesting too. In my role as a school administrator, as a principal, yep. Everybody is allowed to have their personal opinions, right, about the whether they're skeptical, whether they're whatever. And the thing that is important to me in the realm of school, when kids are at school, is, and with staff, is no one's asking you to change in your personal, your deep personal thinking, what things you might believe, because until you start having experiences, I think that's it is, right? It's easy to make fun of something or to be skeptical from afar. And I think the more that people are able to, the more parents are able to feel like it is safe to, work with schools or to encourage their child depending on what they're seeing. And like I said, the stories that I think we're going to put links on this page, the interviews with families that have, and families talk about, seeing this start to come up when kids are just, getting language and starting to exert preferences for things. And, when you see somebody who's 18 months or 2 years old and it's consistent and insistent, for years, it's really hard, I think, once you're in the midst of that to say this is just a phase or that it's just something that the kid's just kind of fooling around or whatever. And I think, and the other thing that comes out of a lot of these interviews is just this deep despair that even little kids feel when they're forced to, it's okay at home and you can dress how you like in the house. And this literally, some of these things that we'll link to are interviews and stories that are done. And these kids are then forced to put on a false identity. And so to imagine feeling like out in the world, you have to walk around faking something, all during your day when you're out at school or you're out at preschool or whatever. And then, that it's not safe to be who you are. Yeah. That's a terrible thing. And that for kids, you talked about bias and sort of the harassment at school. We know that children who, where it's sort of not honored and respected. And because we can't say, here's the test for this, whether it's true or not, or whether it's real or not.
Do you consult with a if you've decided, hey, I think our kid's like, this is a boy, not a girl. Right. Do you go talk to a pediatrician and they say, look, if these 8 things have happened for this many days, or I don't know, however they do it, is there something where they say, yeah?
So my understanding is that, yes, parents absolutely tend to consult, their pediatrician to start talking about it. And like I said, the, American Academy of Pediatrics has policy statements on this. It's not considered something that's, kind of vague or wishy-washy. There's pretty good ways to, and because nothing's done at this, at this point, right? Because that's the next thing is as adults, we start thinking, well, there's physical things that start to happen for adults that want to transition, right? That's a pretty hard transition because you have to do a lot of things.
Which is also, I guess, pretty obvious, but wasn't to me. You don't have to, you can just be transgender and not do any other physical transition.
Well, so here's something I've learned in my, just kind of the research and trying to be more knowledgeable about this is, and in fact, just a couple days ago, something popped up from a TED Talk back in 2013, because I wasn't familiar with how sort of like, okay, I know how the ideal way that we should be dealing this within schools when kids are, between the ages of 5 and let's take through elementary school, 5 up to the age of maybe 11 or 12. And it turns out that, and this is obviously a decision between families and their doctor, but depending on the path that the child's been on, if it becomes something that the family really, believes and the child's very insistent, one of the biggest things that makes it hard for adults who haven't transitioned, medically is, we haven't talked a lot about how how do parents then help children transition physically, right? Medically.
Oh man, that's some advanced parenting. That's a tough one.
And this is where, again, parents consult their pediatricians. Pediatricians refer to endocrinologists. And I learned something within the past 2 days. You're not going to do anything permanent, but what they can start doing so that it eases a kid's transition later is around the age of 12 or before puberty kicks in, is there are medications that endocrinologists can give kids that are put puberty on pause. Doesn't do anything permanent, but it pauses. Wow. And the reason they pause it is that if, as the kid hits the age of 16 or so, and they decide as a family that this is the decision that the child really is insistent, consistent, and persistent about, that becomes the next stage at which then they can start doing things that become more permanent. And then at age 18. Wow. Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing. But here's the thing. If you picture somebody being able to enter adulthood and that, hormones haven't been able to turn on that would make, fully manifest you as a male or female, you've been able to stop that process and furthermore get your physical body more aligned with your gender identity. The dilemma for parents is just incredible, but you can see how as adults that children who have been, honored that way, who have been heard and are able to get their gender identity matching, more their physical identity, their path, their mental health outcomes are so much better because right now they know that, the statistics I think are something like 40% of transgender high school students have thought of suicide.
Really?
Oh yeah. It is not a good outcome.
Wow. It's advanced being a kid too. Right. Not just tough parenting.
On top. So incredibly difficult and challenging mental health outcomes. And so if earlier transitions, the idea is that by honoring and really watching and listening to kids and parents, this is a kid and family, issue, the idea is that you would have much more sort of healthier outcomes for kids as adults because they're not undergoing sort of, more traumatic transitions down the road to try to take away, hormones that have already been in their bodies for years.
And at that age, there's probably not a community. Just making stuff up. But I'm guessing if you're gay, the community is that you're attracted, since it's happening at a later, it's a sexual thing. The community is that
that's an adult.
You find the other people who are like you, and whether you're hiding it or not, there's at least 2 of you. Where a transgender kid's probably like, oh, yeah, I'm just alone in the world.
And it's private, and it is by its nature lonely because, it's not something that you easily run around saying, if you've identified as something that's different than your biological, biology, then it's personal and it's private, and you're not going to easily stumble upon. Yeah, because you're not wearing a sign.
How do the parents take it? Obviously, the full spectrum, but it seems now that at least here in Silicon Valley, the parents I know who have gay kids are like, cool,
absolutely,
fine, whatever. I mean, at least outwardly, they don't seem that upset about it. Has that helped like the transgender kids?
I think transgender, my sense, and I just want to make sure people know I am not, I am somebody who's learning and just because of the role I have in schools, I really want to be ready to support should that come up for families and kids that I interact with. And so I think it's hard, and I think parents must question a lot when their kids are really little. And I think it's just that ongoing questioning, and then hopefully working with, pediatricians. And I think there's support groups out there for parents of kids who are questioning. There's great organizations, particularly in the Bay Area, where I think parents who are trying to figure that out for themselves, is my child just, is this a phase, or is it something that, how can I help my child ultimately reach adulthood as a happy, well-adjusted person? I think that there are plenty of options in the Bay Area, certainly to find like-minded people to say, how will I know? Yeah. How will I know what to do?
It seems so emergent. Like, I don't know, 5 years ago, I couldn't have told you transvestite from transgender. And suddenly, the T is there, and LGBT, like it's on TV. You talk about it. I'm still just intrigued that, like, it's not something that I've known for 30 years. It's something that suddenly is just...
Well, I think there's such safety. I mean, there are such safety risks. And as we were getting ready for this, I didn't have time to go back. But I mean, if I think back over the past 15, 20 years about things that have been in the news, terrible, terrible things about transgender, teenagers and young adults who are trying to live live their lives, and who are, brutally beaten, who end up in, if not killed, in very, very risky and unsafe situations because it's found out that they are transgender. And I think that as people have risked more and become more public, and, we're fortunate we live where we live, I think that people are taking more risks around having conversations about it. And I think there's much more meat to the law around what schools are compelled to address when it comes to just in 2014, January 1st, 2014, a new law kicked in, because AB 1266 that really specified, because there have been previous laws about discrimination, harassment, and what schools are compelled to do to protect, in general, to protect your typical protected classes, race, that kind of thing, that you're not allowing discrimination on your campus.
And this is a state or federal?
That's a state law.
Okay.
States are allowed to make those laws themselves. But then just in January of 2014, another law kicked in that was specifically about that specified transgender issues, and so related to being able to use bathroom facilities that match with their identity, and that's protected, and that schools need to honor that and make that happen. Being able to play on a sports, if it's a gender separated sports team, playing on the team that matches their gender identity. That schools don't have the right to say, sorry, your biology outweighs what you feel as a person. And so I
would think that would be the easy thing for them to do. Like I would guess that's probably why they have if you're a school administrator, I'm sure you're in the middle of one group that thinks it's inappropriate and one group that's like, but that's what my kid is. And you're like, I'm just going to go with the biology. Might have been a way out before the new law. Well,
and I think knowing that, what might the other people in the general public in that school community push back on, if that's what, if we chose to let that be part of the conversation, I think you can acknowledge in a school community, that it might, there was something I just was reading today about, it's not against the law for somebody to be uncomfortable, right? So it's okay that other people may feel uncomfortable with a transgender student, using the bathroom or playing on the sports team, but it's not okay for it to be unsafe for those students to do that. So meaning that, just because other people feel uncomfortable with the notion doesn't mean that we cave on that.
Well, and that's the whole history of racial inequality and how that got dealt with. Like there's a lot of people, it's still to this day, it's against their beliefs even, not just uncomfortable. And
that's why this
doesn't matter.
This is discussed now, I think, as a civil rights issue. It really is. And it's one of those kind of things I just think, because there have been such trauma and such safety issues for kids as they've become young adults. I think the fact, what's fascinating to me is the way that this is kind of played out in the past, look at the past 2 years in the adult world, right? And in, the public sphere around, again, like Caitlyn Jenner. And then I think the show is called Transparent. Jeffrey Tambor, right, won an Emmy, I think, for his portrayal. And I think,
that's a fantastic show, by the way.
Exactly. And his acceptance speech was so moving. And it's just like everything else. I think when we start surfacing this and stop, it's not a taboo topic to discuss, I think it's going to be, I hope in 10 years, maybe it's not 10 years, hopefully it's sooner than that this just becomes an issue that is, it's personal. And to the extent that a family or a student cares to discuss it or not discuss it, we honor that. And they are allowed to fully access their right to, free and appropriate public education, just like any other kid.
Yeah. I wonder who fought for those laws. Like if it was the parents of kids who would not themselves then be necessarily transgender, statistically probably not, or if it was actually the transgender community.
Well, no, I don't think anybody went out of their way, ahead of time. But what's unfortunately, there were a lot of lawsuits. School districts were getting sued because they were not maybe making a good common sense call and maybe being a little too susceptible to, feeling backlash from their communities perhaps. And so, they made decisions that were, when questioned by families and students, were found to be, supporting discriminatory practices. And so, the more recent law, there was, like I said, there was a law in 2000, and that law, let's see, that's one that was AB 537, was passed in 2000, and that started getting at sort of kids have a right to be at school, kind of anti-bullying, right? Kids have a right to be at school and not be harassed and be safe. And specific classes weren't specified. It was kind of what you would find under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. And so states have begun passing, state level law. There's no federal law yet. But there are only, this kind of was awful to think about. There are only 9 states in the country that have passed specific laws about the rights of transgender students in schools. And it's kind of shocking. It is and it isn't. I guess we could say it's
I can imagine a lot of states where that's not...
They're not there yet.
Yeah, where you're not the state senator who's going to fight that battle, probably.
Right.
I mean, I could see it.
Yeah. So I think, I think it's going to continue to grow as an issue to talk about. But I mean, bottom line is that schools, we know, our goal is that kids are at school and learning and being able to launch into adulthood and complete their education. And so the other thing is when harassment and discrimination occurs, rates of truancy or just not showing up at school. You can well imagine if you're a transgender child or a child, who's gay, who is being hassled, you're going to stop showing up at school. And so now you've lost your right to get your free and appropriate public education. And so these laws have an impact across the board. So it's good that they're there. But as I was saying before, I think, we come at it from both. There's a moral imperative, right, to do what's right for kids. Well, we can't count on that because people come from lots of different backgrounds about how they feel personally. So in my realm and the way I've, talked to my staff about it is that we are ethical imperative. We have ethical imperatives in our profession around keeping kids safe. And that means not just physically safe, but emotionally safe, socially safe. And then there's, and now further we have legal imperatives, which we start from that point of view, which is, hey, your personal opinion about any of this is no one's trying to change anybody's mind about how you feel when you go home at night. But when we're at school, we want to be crystal clear that our role is to support the safety of all students, no matter what. And it kind of simplifies things. And I think that's where we need to go with, families, if there are issues with families and, kind of if there's community pushback, which, I think in certain situations may come up for some schools, but I think it's got to be, hey, all kids. All kids all the time.
I guess I hadn't heard the stories, but I guess there are people who are not happy about people being transgender and which I've never, having grown up in California, I never feel like people actually choose that battle or care, but apparently they do. I
think when it comes up or they, you might hear of a circumstance that's closer to your community, and I think people tend to think, really, there's that skepticism.
That is that was my bias, was kind of like a girl who wants to play sports, like that's a tomboy, and we had that forever, and you can call it whatever the hell you want, but
come on, really? It sounds like parents sort of indulging kids and or making more of something than it is.
But then when you realize how difficult, obviously,
why would anyone choose that path?
Yeah.
That path of challenge and just real difficulty for their kids. And, I think so we had started to say that, in the adult world, there had been, I think, a growing awareness, right? And especially with the Caitlyn Jenner transition, very public transition, earlier this year. And so kind of around that time, I think what's blown this open a little bit more, like I said, Rolling Stone put out this article back, in 2013 about a very young child. And it was for me, that was the beginning for me of an awareness, just like what you've talked about, which is I didn't know. And I read this article and it was just kind of blew my mind because I had no point of reference for it. And it helped me right from the get-go of reading this to think, how could anybody think anything else when you hear the kind of agony that these parents are going through about this difficult, and not that it shouldn't end up being a negative situation. It should just be helping a child, ultimately kind of discover who they are and help them align who they are. And so that was the only foundation I had for much of anything. And then I think, as you just continue, again, the adult world, some of the transitions that have been happening, but what happened this past spring was, and some people may have caught this in the news, but, Congressman Mike Honda.
Oh yeah, so I don't know this story completely. So starting with who Michael.
So Mike Honda is a long-term congressman for a district in the South Bay, and he's been in Congress a really long time, and he had been asked in February to go speak at a school superintendent's conference, and my understanding is he wasn't able to make it, and so he sent them a statement instead. And Mike Honda is he's head of the Congressional Anti-Bullying Caucus, so he's been in that role for a long time. He also co-founded the Congressional LGBT Equality Caucus with Barney Frank.
Yep.
And there's another congressman that was part of that too. I apologize, I don't know her name, but that was back in 2008. So he's had a demonstrated commitment to this for a long time, and so he sent a statement followed by a Twitter. He tweeted out a really nice tweet with his granddaughter. Who is transgender.
Yeah, wow.
And it really hit the news.
Yeah.
It was a very, very public figure, being very forthcoming about his very personal experience with having a transgender granddaughter. And so that was in February. And then by April, another thing that was big in the news this year was NBC Nightly News did a series I think it was about mid-April. We'll put the link up for that too.
Yep.
They did a series and profiled two children who had been, whose parents had been through this, were going through this experience. And so that was, I think, I have to say in my experience, that was the first time this issue related to children had been so publicly.
Yep. Well, I think that's probably something that's happening too, is that when, Jeffrey Tambor, the actor on Transgender, winning the Emmy, and then I don't follow that whole thing, but I know everyone else does. It doesn't occur to you, those are like adults. So you're kind of like, oh, if, an NFL player came out as being gay, like that whole narrative, it doesn't even come into your thinking, oh, wait, no, 4-year-old kids and 5-year-old kids. So even that didn't open up anything in my mind about kids. So it was like, I very much equated to like the kind of thing that we all saw in the gay community, which was, young men kind of organizing their power and changing something. So so that just wasn't obvious to me from that opening up of things until I started having conversations with people.
And I think the most powerful thing of all, for people that might still feel somewhat skeptical of, the legitimacy of this as an authentic, medical issue, is to watch these interviews. And I mean, these are to this NBC Nightly News, listening to Mike Honda speak about his personal experiences. When you listen to parents detail out their experiences and realize they are not looking to have their kids be poster children for anything. Want, we all as parents want our kids to be safe and happy and healthy.
Yeah.
That's what any parent wants for their child. And so to tune into this and then to decide, I'm going to have to help advocate for my child based on what I'm, seeing from them. It's such a, I think, pretty gut wrenching for parents at the beginning as they start to explore this. And I think when you listen to these interviews, there's nothing stronger, I think, to help someone understand what the glimmers of what it might be like. But I also think how authentic it truly is.
Yeah.
To actually listen to interviews with parents. And there's on the web just countless now ways that you can. There was just something somebody messaged to me the other day about. I think on Cosmopolitan Magazine's website, there's a really lovely interview with a family. So, Rolling Stone, Cosmopolitan,
right.
This is becoming something that I think the media really does, is creating a platform where this information, so we're not just looking at it from afar.
Yeah.
If we don't know somebody that has a transgender child, we can, through the virtual world, we can sort of hear someone's story, see their faces, see the child and think, oh, wow, my mind is blown, but okay.
Yeah. Well, and sure enough, the media probably came from one of those reporters having a kid.
Absolutely. I think it's been underground.
Yeah.
And that's why kids end up with trauma, when they're transitioning more openly as adolescents, that I'm guessing the signs were there all the way along, and it just was too difficult for parents to, not support it, but just, it's risky. It's been risky for kids.
Yeah. Well, I thought it'd just be nice to take a gentle walk down the path and nothing medical, nothing I'm not going to join the community or anything, but just oh yeah, I've been thinking about this, not very hard. And the second I spent a couple seconds on, I'm like, I don't think I'm lined up right on all this, or have even the sketches of a story. And I think we have a little bit of sketches of how this works now.
Good.
Have we covered this?
I think so.
I think it's pretty good.
All right.
Hey, thanks so much for doing this.
This was really neat. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk.
All right. My guest, Allison White. This is Kent Lindstrom. This has been the Something About Your podcast. Thanks so much.